A celebration such as this Musica Nova Festival can certainly arouse the curiosity of music lovers and the general public. It also raises many expectations amongst musicians and composers themselves. The subject of new music has long been controversial. Antagonists, or traditional music lovers on one side, and contemporary composers on the other. They've maintained their enmity across a chasm which it seemed for many years would never close. Something's certainly happening, though. In new music, there are signs that the chasm is definitely narrower and bridges are being thrown across. Even traditional audiences are won over. For the interval of this opening concert from Musica Nova, we've asked two composers from two different generations to talk to you. What's surprising is the similarity in their points of view. Between the makers of new music too, the gap seems to have closed a great deal. First to speak will be visiting American John Corigliano, aged 52, and he'll be followed without any further introduction by Robert Davidson, young Brisbane composer of just 24 years.
Classical music, unfortunately, is such a microcosm of the world. And in fact, it really came true to me coming here on the way. I stopped in Honolulu and visited some friends of my librettist. And they were very educated people, and they were having discussions about this artist and this play and this painting and this, this novel. And then they started talking about music. And everything ended. Vivaldi's The Seasons in Bolero was about all they could mention. And I thought to myself, these are cultivated people, and they don't know anything about music. It's really terrible to know how isolated we really are. But I know that we are dealing with, unfortunately, a world that is far too small for the quality and kind of effort that we put into it, and we just keep trying. The problem with being flexible and going into many worlds of music is that there's a 19th century romantic attitude about the composer, and that is that he sits up in this little garret writing his symphonies and pays no attention to the world below him, doesn't speak to them, is not interested in communicating with them, but simply has this message that is for the future. And that's really dying off now. That was something that was very prevalent in the 50s, and I think that we've learned better. That never was the attitude. Beethoven was very concerned with reaching people. I mean, he stormed off the stage because he was deaf and didn't realize the audience was applauding enough. Mozart used to change movements of symphonies when he went to various cities because he didn't think they'd like that movement, so he stuck another one in. I mean, this is part of life. Bach was composing away for, his Sunday job and getting his jobs done. If it was a rock score of the day, he would have done it too. I don't do that anymore, by the way, rock, not because I don't like it. I don't particularly like it, actually, but that's not the real reason. The reason is that I'm busy and I have commissions. I started off like Leonard Bernstein did as Lenny Amber, by the way, doing it in his day. I started off trying to earn a living in my craft. And that meant everything in my craft, whether it was, popular music or arranging or becoming a recording producer for Columbia Records or whatever. And I think that composers have a real problem of survival, and it's the kind of thing that they all have to face unless they're rich, and I certainly did have to face it. And I took a lot of positions, and I learned from each one of them. I think that it was a good thing, but it certainly was not that I said, I think I'm going to arrange some rock because that would be a wonderful thing to do. I said, gee, they're going to pay me some real money to do this. And nobody was asking me to write music at that time. I had no commissions. So I said, let me do that. Let me earn a living being a composer and a musician. As my craft dictates, I'll try. And that's real. That's life. And it's the way I think composers grow and learn, becoming part of the real world. I like to be part of the real world. I like to function in it. Our real world is pretty small, as I said. It's not the real world of writing a film score, which I've also done. I mean, everybody, when you say, I mention any of these kids, and I come to colleges or anything else, the minute they hear altered states, they say, oh, wow, Well, I've also written, chamber music, symphonies, opera, concertos, but those are for a very small audience compared with Altered States and Revolution, which reached everybody. So we do reach a small group. I'd love to reach a bigger group. I'm doing the best I can, and I think the main way is to write as fine music as you can. There was a situation that arose, and it had to do, in a sense, with modern art being incomprehensible. Now, I'm not talking about complex. I'm talking about understanding, because I write complex music, but I try to lead people through it musically so that they understand it. And also, I know that the complexities can be understood with the ear. That is, I could, if you listen enough, you can find the logic of the music. Now, the problem is that a language was developed in Germany that is impossible to hear and understand. A 12-tone music did that with pitch, and we all know that. And what happened is that the complexity of the permutations of the pitches are impossible to hear unless you have a chart of the row and the various permutations of the row and follow that. When that got into serial music, which means that in not just organization of those 12 pitches, but organization of rhythm, of timbre, of attack, of tempi, etc., are all done according to various permutations. The fact is, the intellectual process went out of music completely for the listener. That is, music became, the only way you could listen to music was subjectively in a kind of, I like that sound, the high one I liked, the middle one I didn't like, but my favorite was the one in the very bottom. That was my favorite sound. I mean, that's the only way you can listen to a piece of, say, Babbitt, a serial composer, which is a shame because it's a completely intellectual piece, but you can't listen to it with your mind. You have to listen to it in a rather dumb way. And I don't like listening to music only emotionally. I like to use my mind, so that music does not excite me. It's interesting that Stockhausen, for example, a composer who used that technique, which, by the way, makes music incomprehensible, which is one of the goals of that kind of modernism, jumped off from total organization into total disorganization and started writing aleatoric music, which is just as impossible to hear because it has no logic, because it's basically chance music. That is, you know, play a high note, play a low note, play a fast run, etc. Now, to make that transference is about the most yin and yang things I've ever heard of, to go from the most organized music to disorganized music. But they have one thing in common. You can't understand the most organized music because of the system used with your ear. You have to understand it by studying the score with various charts. You can't understand chance music because there is nothing to understand. It's accident. It happens just randomly. And that is the virtue of those musics to many people, that you can't understand it. Now, what is the virtue of incomprehensibility? I can't figure that out. Complexity, I can see a virtue to, that it's a foil to simplicity. That is, when you have a beautiful, elegant, simple phrase, you might want something complex before it to set it up, or afterwards. That music can be complex and beautiful and tense and dramatic. Alban Berg is complex, but he's comprehensible because Berg used the 12-tone system but also abandoned it when it was necessary and had a set of values that were based upon the ear. The problem is, if you don't have that set of values, and if you write music that is incomprehensible, you have shut the audience off intellectually. The smallest little prelude of Rachmaninoff is 10,000 times more intellectually stimulating than Elliott Carter's Concerto for Three Orchestras. That doesn't mean that Carter's isn't more intellectual. It means we can't hear any more intellectually out of that. We can hear more out of a little minuet by Haydn intellectually. Now, that's very sad. That means that we're being treated like idiots. And I don't like it. That's what I don't like. And that's why I reject it. I don't like aleatoric music for that reason, unless it's controlled, as I do in my music, and therefore has an intellectual basis. And I don't like music that is organized in a way that I can't hear and understand, because, unfortunately, I don't carry those charts around with me, and I don't spend 3 weeks studying before I go to a concert. And I think it's the job of a composer to make me understand. And if the goal is that I shouldn't understand, which is also the goal, I might add, in certain minimalist pieces where the program matter, not the music, which is very understandable, overly so, but the kind of philosophical program matter or opera connotations, etc., usually are fairly dada or, based upon that kind of incomprehensible non-logic. See, non-logic has become a part of art, and non-logic is fun for a little while. It can be fun to see John Cage, play around with 7 radios on a stage and have everybody laugh and giggle. That's fun for a little bit. But honestly and truthfully, that is not a sustaining, important contribution to art. You have to have a lot of courage to be simple. There's no question about it. I had a student once in Manhattan School who was going for his doctoral degree and wrote a very fine piece. And it was in a kind of neo-romantic Straussian framework. And he was very competitive and very worried about his peers, his other composers at the school, so much so that he did not correct the mistakes in the parts and in the score, because he wanted the wrong notes to be there so that it would sound more modern. And I had a real talk with this poor kid and said, you wrote a beautiful piece. Why are you doing this? And he finally confessed that to me. He said, well, if it has more illogical dissonances in it, my fellow composers will think more of it. And I said, well, who are you writing this for? I don't think that simplicity for its own sake is any better than complexity for its own sake. I think that those two should be used by a creative person to create a work of art. I've been composer in residence at the Chicago Symphony for 3 years, and we have reading sessions for young composers. We get tremendous amount of scores in. And to see the difference in the kind of music that's being written now and 10 years ago is staggering, and it's so much for the better. There are still people writing 12-tone music, as there should be, because they believe in it and they love it. But there are people writing tonal music, there are minimalists, there are aleatoric people, there are eclectics that combine them all. I really think that the only way that we can flourish as a musical community is if we allow all these things to exist, we play them all, and just as in the past, 98% of them are going to fall to the ground and disappear, and 2% will go on to become part of the repertoire. After all, Hummel was bigger than Beethoven in his day. Hummel is not bigger than Beethoven now. So we should play everything. We should give everything a chance, and then we should understand that most pieces probably are not great. On the other hand, what is more exciting than going to a world premiere and having a conductor raise a baton and not knowing what's going to happen? Fine. They're hearing it for the first time. They have a right to make up their minds. They should. And that's the excitement of going to concerts.
I find it encouraging that the 4 visiting overseas composers for Musica Nova are all committed to accessibility and communication with the audience. I see them as representing a healthy trend in serious composition, one which means a bright future for young composers such as myself. I'd like to step into the dangerous area of forecasting and to speak about this future and some of my hopes for it. But let me stress that this is a very personal view, and I am not trying to set forth the only way music should be. To quote the writer of the Book of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. Certain streams of serious music in the West have been virtually obsessed with novelty and innovation this century, the obsession rising to feverish pitch during the 60s when many composers tried to reinvent music with each new piece. One person, however, cannot carry such a burden. Music can really only develop when some sort of tradition arises, and many composers, performers and listeners develop common language. I believe that the 20th century preoccupation with innovation in composition will fade and give way to a more balanced integration of additional concerns such as communication, expression, character, structure and beauty. Too much serious music of this century has been quite lopsided towards either innovation, expression or structure, resulting in a failure to be meaningful to many people. My hope is that an aesthetic of beauty will return as a major concern of the arts, a deep beauty which is inherent and intrinsic in the artwork and which does not depend on socio-cultural knowledge. This is starting to happen. Music should speak for itself and be meaningful to anyone, at least to some degree, whether or not they understand its cultural background, structure and intentions. The acclaimed author Douglas Hofstadter, in his book Gödel, Escher, Bach, imagines the difference between sending a record of Bach's music into space and a record of John Cage's music in the event of some alien civilization discovering and attempting to understand the two. He argues that for the meaning of a Cage piece to emerge, it must be taken in a large cultural setting, as a revolt against certain kind of traditions. Thus, if we want to transmit that meaning, we must send along with the record an extensive history of Western culture. An appreciation of the Bach record would require far less cultural knowledge, loaded as it is with intrinsic patterning. I personally would rather follow the Bach model than that of Cage. Of course, much more meaning may be understood from Bach when we know its background, but a basic tacit understanding is possible without this knowledge. Similarly, Mozart commented that he wrote music for everyday people, but put things in which only a connoisseur would appreciate. This sort of multi-levelled meaning gives richness and accessibility to music, which I see as highly desirable. It gives entrance to a much larger and more committed audience. I believe that for composers, it is becoming less and less fashionable to be misunderstood. It may also become less possible to survive and be misunderstood, at least in Australia. We now have a comparatively high level of government funding for composers in this country, and this is not guaranteed to last, particularly with the current economic climate. Composers may have to contend more and more with the marketplace, where there is little room for the luxury of self-indulgence. This could have negative effects, but also some very positive effects, such as bringing greater accountability for serious composition, accountability to audiences and the public rather than to small groups of academics. composers may not find themselves in the happy situation of this festival, high-quality performances with the government footing the bill. After all, society does not owe us a living. We may need to organise our own performances and have more accountability for rehearsal time, recording and other costs, and accordingly we may find ourselves writing more practically than previously. Music which is seen as significant must make performing sense. It cannot be just paper music, the result of an inbred academy. There are, of course, far more people living today than at any other time in history. This means that there are also far more musicians, and therefore a great multiplicity, a great variety in music today. Added to that, we in the West are more aware than before of the value of music coming from people who are not Western, male, white and educated. It is difficult to see how any sort of mainstream of composition can survive in the future. Diversity will continue to increase, not so much through innovation, but through the recognition, integration and development of many existing traditions. And there will not be one sacrosanct, correct way of making music. From this vantage point, it seems ludicrous to condemn tonality as backward-looking, as it has continued happily along in this century, developing in an overwhelming number of ways in the vast majority of the world's music-making. Tonality will continue to be the foundation for most music, and will return to prominence in serious new music. I believe that musical intuition will become more important than it has recently been for many composers in the compositional process. Musical intuition is intricately formed from childhood, paralleling language, and may be relied upon to create music of great natural complexity, so that there is no need to resort to artificially contrived complexity. Composers are moving towards a situation in which the ear will be consulted more than complicated charts and series. We will not be writing to impress with spectacular complexity, but to communicate beauty in some sense. We will return to a situation of complexity coexisting happily with simplicity. We will not write to show how clever we are, but to add to the richness of our audience's lives, to create something meaningful, which both we and they can treasure. As a result, our society will place greater value on the role of the composer than it does at present. Many of these idealistic predictions of mine are based on trends which have been occurring for some time. And as I said earlier, our 4 visiting overseas composers are all taking part in some of those trends. To summarise, it seems to me that we are moving away from many 20th century ideas which have often resulted in music which has alienated, mystified and bored audiences, as indeed much of it was intended to do. The music which results when we give up our addiction to innovation, extreme self-expression and extraordinary complexity is, in my view, far more valuable in terms of depth, humanity, meaning, interest and beauty, and also, ironically, structure, expression and character. I personally want to write music which will cause me to answer yes when I put the question to myself, is this what you got into music for in the first place?
Young Brisbane composer Robert Davidson, reflecting on the present state of composition. Earlier we heard visiting American composer John Corigliano. This is John Crawford welcoming you back to the stage of the Queensland Performing Arts Centre, and we're broadcasting the opening concert from the Musica Nova Festival in Brisbane. Intervals over, you can hear the orchestra tuning on stage, the Queensland Symphony Orchestra tonight, and our conductor is Richard Mills. I mentioned earlier that there were a number of subtexts to this, the biggest ever Australian New Music Festival. I think I mentioned that Alice in Wonderland and T.S. Eliot were subtexts, and the importance of literary associations. There is another, though, that of many of today's composers reacting to the languages of much mid-20th century music. Certainly the comments of those we heard during the interval talk bear out a very strong reaction, even though this is perhaps based on misunderstanding of the intentions and even the results of music by Cage and his associates, or by music of the older generations of Europeans. Reactions, nevertheless, a fait accompli, and the works which we're hearing tonight, and indeed many places around the world today, showing an interest in these much older sounds and patterns.